good crowd.
Yeah.
I wish there was like seats on the floor or something. So should I start just chatting a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. So this kind of, in a way, arose because Doug and I both were doing columns for Arthur magazine and sort of have been aware of each other's work for quite a number of years. And it seemed like we had really different perspectives on the notion of prophecy and sort of what this kind of psychedelic, visionary sort of consciousness might mean or suggest for the future. And so I thought actually that our ideas were very, very different. Now it feels like maybe we've arrived at a similar perspective somehow as time has gone by. So we're going to see, I think what we'll do is we'll both kind of explain some of our concepts around these ideas. And then we will open it to the audience for questions, then we'll kind of riff back and forth. Well, I guess we'll riff back and forth for a bit and then open it to the audience for questions. And when we open it to questions, we're going to be as nice as we can be, but we're also going to, if people start going on tangents and ranting, we're going to cut them off for the good of the whole operation. Okay? So I'm really sorry there aren't more seats. I mean, a few people maybe could sit on the floor. I don't know.
Sure.
Like maybe 3 or 4, like you guys could sit on the floor, more people could move in, or people could move back. I don't know. But maybe not. Maybe
we'll rotate. There's a couple of little bench places.
Yeah, I think there's like, you guys could, like a few people could sort of fill in here.
Respect the elderly.
Yeah. So, yeah, so we're going to just take a few minutes each to sort of introduce ourselves and our relationship to these. There's also some bench seats right there. Okay.
I don't like furniture.
Okay, cool. Okay, so you want to start?
Sure. It's funny, oddly enough, I wasn't prepared to talk about psychedelics, but I may as well. For me, the most illuminating thing about psychedelics was the insight that I had been living in a particular reality tunnel, right? And that had been constructed for me, and I constructed for myself, and that we all kind of live in these reality tunnels, and there's ways to remove some of the filters and some of the constructs temporarily in order to see, or at least see secondhand through the chemical. But there's a whole bunch of other ways of looking at things. And it set me on a mission really since college, when I had those experiences, to help people get that the reality we're living in is much more up for grabs than most of us acknowledge on a daily basis. That, to use the programming metaphor, that reality is open source, and that if you learn the codes through which it's programmed, you can be a reality programmer rather than just a user. And that we walk around in our daily life mistaking a lot of what is actually software for hardware. You know, that there's stuff we accept as given circumstances, as the way things are, that are actually the way things happen to be. And many of them are the way things happen to be because other people decided that's the way they should be. So I've been for a long time looking for, I mean, that's why I'm kind of a media theorist now, looking for ways people can really get underneath the content of communication and see the biases of all of the ways in which we communicate, and the biases of all of the social structures, the biases of living in a city that's a grid pattern instead of a round pattern, and realize that these biases are not created by God, right? But these are biases.
Can I break in for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with him. When I wrote my first book, Breaking Open the Head, and I went back and was sort of rethinking psychedelics, my first experiences with psychedelics in college had given me the exact same perception that, you know, I've been living in this realm where I assumed that, you know, money and cars and sports statistics were kind of just like these natural processes that we had no control over. And then it's almost like the mushroom especially had this kind of other wisdom or intelligence to it, or introduced me to this perspective where I could see that these were just temporary constructs, and that we'd mistaken them for somehow inevitable outcomes. You know?
And then what I got interested in then is trying to figure out how is it people are made to actually believe stuff? It's like I always thought religions were really cool. I love religions, but I'm fascinated by the fact that people actually believe in the religions. You know, and so I figured, all right, I'm a Jew, so I'm going to look at Jewish literature and Jewish mythology and figure out what is it in there that's telling people you actually have to believe this thing. And as I read Torah and did a lot of studying about what I think were more the intentions of Torah's writers in the context of history at that moment, in other words, what was going on, I got this totally other impression of Torah, that it wasn't meant to be this sort of real estate document saying the Jews are loved most by God and deserve this piece of land and all that, but it's actually a rallying cry for open source reality. It's a myth. It's a story about a group of people who live in a certain kind of slavery, go out into the desert, and then write their own laws. And that writing of laws is supposed to be a continual process. I mean, in the American Constitution, at least as I was taught it, is another great example of people who created a document that was meant to evolve, that was meant to be improved upon, that they accepted there are a bunch of people and there's going to be this other bunch of people. So then, and that's why I wrote this thing that I've just been writing now called Testament, I thought that what I needed to do was to show people the sort of what I see as the real message of these stories and the real use of these allegories and the misuse of them today. Because there's a lot of people who look at the Bible and Torah and all, and they say what's important about it is that it's all true, that all this really happened, that God made the earth in these many days, and Moses existed and went to this mountain and got this divine transmission and then did this, and all this stuff actually happened historically. And I think the mistake that those people are making is that they're confusing mythos with chronos. They're confusing mythology with history. And that the value of these stories, and to me they are valuable, is not that they happened at some moment in history, but that they are still happening today. They're continually happening today. And I don't mean in the sense of, oh, Revelations means that this bad thing is going to happen today. No, I mean that we are all Cain, jealous of our brother. We're all Moses dealing with this problem, that we're still sacrificing our children to fire gods by sending them off to the Gulf War, and that these stories are deeply relevant, only they've gotten in the hands of like the totally wrong people, and they're being used in a totally silly way, so silly and so sanctimoniously that the power of these prophecies is actually being hidden from us. And most of us think the Bible is just this thing that the Gideons put in the tray of your nightstand in a hotel, and that this is just all that Jerry Falwell stuff, when it totally isn't. And I had this sense that if anybody actually read this stuff, if they just read a couple of chapters, they'd go, oh man, this is, I was looking at Crowley, right? I was reading Adam Blavatsky and all that. This is the source code. This is like the source code through which that is iterated out as this thing we now live in called Western civilization. And that one of the ways to hack this civilization is to get in to that, to the mythological constructs by which we live, in many cases unconsciously, and have an opportunity to kind of experience them firsthand, to receive them ourselves, rather than have them literally administered to us by some by some high priest. And that then, I mean, and this is a very Enlightenment ideal, but then each of us as individuals can develop a sense of agency about how we view the world, about how we experience the world, and how we want to enact a reality that's more consonant with our own ethical sensibilities. So that's sort of where I'm at. I do think there's an urgent need for myth, but I think just as urgent as our need for myth is our need to understand that myths themselves are the creations of people, and however they're received...
Or maybe people are the creation of myths.
Well, we co-create, but I think that this stuff is all construction. It's all written, sometimes by smart people, sometimes by groups. I think the reason why Torah is great is because it was written by a bunch of people over a whole lot of time. So it's got the benefit of generations and generations of cumulative effort. That's why that's going to be better than something I probably, sit alone in my closet and write. But that we all have access to this, sometimes alone in ourselves and better with each other, which is why I like this event so much, because we've got, this is cross-fertilization, right? This is what makes something valuable. It's not preaching to our own sort of converted reader base, but actually mixing, talking, engaging. I'm so sick of blogs, right? I just don't care about that person anymore. But I'm totally into discussions, into meetings, into trans-faith dialogues and conversation, because that's the way to really get something rolling.
So that was Doug's intro to this talk. I sort of came around to thinking about prophecy accidentally, in a sense. I'd written this first book, Breaking Open the Head, and that book kind of charted, I sort of went through this spiritual crisis in my late 20s. I've been working as a journalist in New York, and editor of a literary magazine. And I sort of hit this sort of dark night of the soul, and then I went back through my kind of past, and I tried to remember if I'd ever had any sense of any kind of opening to another form of consciousness, and sort of remember my psychedelic experiences from college. And I decided that, although they were really kind of like nobody in my world at that point was into them at all, they were kind of like a laughing stock in a sense, that I would go back and delve into it. So I began to, I found mushrooms and LSD again, sort of reconnected those experiences. Then because I was a journalist, I was able to do some writing. So I wrote a piece about taking ayahuasca. How many people here know what ayahuasca is? So most people at this point know. It's pretty interesting just watching the kind of, it's a tangent, I guess, watching how ayahuasca has moved into the mainstream consciousness over the last few years. When I wrote the book, it seemed like in a room like this, maybe 5 people would know what it was. But anyway, ayahuasca, so I did that down in a ceremony downtown and wrote about it, had this kind of visionary experience. And then I got an assignment from a magazine to go down to West Africa and take Iboga in a tribal initiation. Iboga being this long-acting West African psychedelic. And I'd been told that, I'd read and told that could act like 10 years of psychoanalysis in one night, which seemed totally impossible and absurd to me. But when I actually had the experience, it was a little bit like that, and it was deeply personal and psychoanalytic, and I went back through a lot of early childhood memories and had this whole sense of how I'd been kind of constructed as a person up to that point. And also there was a kind of prophetic dimensions there where I got sort of hints about the future, my future progress and possibilities. It was very liberational, actually. Although the experience was very difficult, the stuff tasted horrible, it made you kind of sick and throw up, and you couldn't sleep for days after. The tribe was very hard-ass with me in many respects. It ended up giving me this sense of freedom, like the sense of that although I'd been constructed up to that point, I sort of could take back my will and do with it as I wanted. So then there were these prophetic hints, and the guy who took me down there, this botanist, said that when he was initiated into Iboga, he'd been shown that he wasn't going to live too long, and lo and behold, like a year and a half later, he died in a freak car accident. And there was stuff that these shamans told me about my family, which seemed like they were just accessing this other form of knowledge. So that really, I think at that point I recognized that this was a book that I wanted to write. And it took me a few years to get to it, and I ended up going back, I went down to the Amazon to work with ayahuasca more deeply with a tribe in Ecuador, and I also visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico and explored synthetic psychedelics, and sort of had one opening after another, and also experiences that were really kind of occult, that in a way that I had never believed in the occult. So I had this experience of the substance that sort of opened me up to some kind of it seemed like almost like a demonic war or something, and this figure following me around, and mirrors falling off walls, and poltergeist phenomena. And I had no context for believing any of this stuff, so it was deeply jarring to my whole reality. And so the book ended up charting my shift from kind of a secular materialist worldview to accepting that there was this occult, esoteric, psychic reality. And then, sort of the corollary of that was that, if we looked at the modern West, we've kind of totally embraced this rational, empirical way of thinking and being, and we've dismissed, I mean, it's pretty literal in terms of our repression and sort of outlawing of psychedelic substances, but we've really, and the burning of the witches in the Middle Ages, we've kind of repressed and legislated against this whole form of consciousness, this more kind of intuitive, mystical understanding of reality. So I began to wonder if we'd made such a huge turn away from this arena, and yet there was actual legitimacy to this whole way of being. What we could learn, what we maybe had to learn from indigenous cultures and their knowledge systems, and I began to think about what these cultures might be saying about the time that we're in. And then it turns out that a lot of them have very specific concepts that were in this time of transformation or prophecy. And the Hopi talk about this being the movement from the fourth world to the fifth world, and they say they've seen all these signs that were predicted in their oral transmissions. And then very specifically, the Mayan calendar appears to end in the year 2012, or it sort of turns over at least into a new cycle. And while mainstream archaeologists tend to be sort of poo-pooing that that's interesting, they say it's just like a sort of odometer turning over or something. These sort of outsider scholars, many of them, have explored psychedelics, who also have this possibility of transformation in their minds, think that the Mayans were also seeing it as a shift from kind of one world age to the next, or what I end up arguing in the book is a potential transformation of planetary consciousness for us. And then I had my own personal experience. I was sort of collecting this information and looking at it from all these angles and trying to really integrate the ideas of Carl Jung. I'd grown up in this really Freudian background, so Jung had never really been discussed. Or he was like, oh, he's a fascist or something. I don't really think about him. But his ideas became like one of the central threads to the book, and his way of thinking about archetypes and the shadow and the collective unconscious and so on. So I sort of integrated all this material. I was working with it really hard. I ended up going down to Brazil to work with this religion, Santo Daime, that uses ayahuasca as its sacrament. It was started in the 1920s by kind of rubber tappers and mestizos who were down in the Amazon working, and they began to drink ayahuasca with the local tribes. And they began to have visions of like the Virgin Mary or the Mother of the Forest, and they ended up creating this tradition or this religion that kind of merges Christianity with indigenous spirituality. And while I was sort of down in Brasilia and then moving to the Amazon, I began to have these direct prophetic transmissions that basically were telling me very emphatically that I was somehow an avatar of this Mayan spirit, Quetzalcoatl, or somehow helping to bring a kind of different knowledge system back to the West. And so that definitely shook me up and kind of messed with my head for a long time, and took a while to kind of come back to earth and integrate that experience and figure out how to contextualize it properly. I got very interested in the whole Jung and his followers talk about this archetypal domain, and that it actually can kind of constellate in a society. Like, I mean, I argue also, like, following this Jungian disciple Edinger, who says that he wrote a book called Archetype of the Apocalypse, and he believes that we are in this time of the apocalypse, which he calls the time of the momentous event of the coming of the self into conscious realization. So, it could be a very positive thing, but it is a very traumatic thing also. It's kind of like a certain way of having this kind of separate ego identity, maybe like reaching the end of its possible logic, and we're being challenged to go into a different framework of thought and being in the future. So that's an archetype that's constellating, and this Mayan calendar connection to that seems to be a kind of archetype that we're regaining. It started in the 70s with Terence McKenna, who went down to the Amazon and sort of, he's pretty great. He's pretty wild too. I mean, just how many people here have read Terence McKenna? Yeah, it's just throwing out there that one of his ideas is that the mushrooms are actually a galactic intelligence that distributes itself to the universe as spores on meteorites that crash to inhabitable planets, wait till mammals develop a system, then creates a symbiotic relationship with them, helps them evolve consciousness and language. And basically what happened during his experience in the Amazon was the mushrooms began to say, hey, we're going to help you move into the galactic mainstream here. We're going to help you shift to the next level of consciousness. But first you have to understand that your whole model of time is totally wrong, and that time is actually different than you think, that there are kind of shifts into different orders of time, and that you're on the cusp of this shift. And so he ended up formalizing that with this time wave zero concept, which is basically looking at novelty as this kind of increase in novelty, leading to then this kind of shift into singularity, which for various reasons is an idea I critique a little bit in my book, but it's pretty interesting. So then there's Jose Arguelles and Carl Johan Kalaman, who's taken this this Mayan calendar material around 2012 and formalized it in great detail. So anyway, so that's a sort of tangent. Basically, so I then had to deal with my own experience of this Quetzalcoatl archetype, and it was really helpful. I mean, the woman I was with, who's sort of my teacher and this shaman in California, was also a Jungian psychoanalyst, so she really helped me work through the archetypes. And she actually worked with the mother as an archetype and would go into trances where this kind of divine mother would speak through her. But she, basically the idea is that it's a very difficult experience when archetypal material comes down into your psyche, and it can be kind of like, it almost feels like it's taking possession of you, and you have to be careful, and your ego has to be kind of supple enough to mediate it, and ultimately, come back to the fact that you are just your normal, goofy human personality. So that's where I ended up coming back to.
I think the trick is you can get exposed to major ideas in a number of different ways. You can read Horkheimer and Adorno and Benjamin and see people who understood that the systems we put in place in the Renaissance in order to increase the central authority of the church and the state, the creation of centralized currency, the outlawing of local currencies, the creation of state religions and the outlawing of local religion, the repression of what are called the female archetypes, and more importantly, the repression of women, could only last 400 or 500 years, right? Until the shit would hit the fan, and you'd get end-stage capitalism and fascism, and which is just corporatism. You would get this thing. In other words, that if you really invest heart and soul into money, it will get a body, right? And it will grow. And that we're dealing with that. So you can read. It's like I'll assign something like Adorno or Horkheimer or Marx or something to a student, and they come in the next day and they're like, oh man, right? So now they've had this sort of intellectual reckoning. You can also, when you see these kinds of things on psychedelics, when you have this realization on psychedelics, it's really tricky because the realization becomes really fractal. In other words, it's not just the economy we're talking about, it's the atoms, it goes all the way from the cosmic level all the way down to the microcosmic level and everywhere in between, and there's a few traps then that can get you stuck. One is it's all just so amazing and beautiful in its way, even if it's destruction, that you know what I mean? You can get stuck in the chandelier itself, right? In the way it all makes sense, right? As opposed to just, oh, this is what's happening. I mean, look at anything on strong enough acid, and it's not just what it is, but it's what it is, right? Right? And that's tricky. That's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to navigate. And the danger, I think, at that point is when the allegories, when the constructs you've witnessed that have been able to reflect to you what's going on become the thing itself that you care about. That can be paralyzing too. I mean, when you have a born-again experience, if you transfer the authority onto an image of the experience or an allegory in the experience rather than bringing it back home, like you are with Evolver, say, rather than, and I don't mean just to say you all have to be activists, but it's a matter of how does this then translate? How do we get off?
Or how do you integrate it? Because I think the big problem with the psychedelic experience since the 60s through today has been you have these, you get these sort of glimpses of this kind of transcendent domain where it seems there's all this stuff going on, but then you come back to this quotidian reality and you have to deal with your taxes and your house and everything and your job.
It's the same as the raver who experiences we are all one together, the thing. I know we'll feel this way tomorrow morning, won't we?
I mean, that for me is one of the extraordinary things about the Burning Man Festival, which I've written about in both books, is that it gives you, in a collective experience for a week, or you can try to stretch it out to 10 days if you come early and stay late, a sense of what it would be like to live in that kind of more transcendent zone as a permanent state. It's like super synchronistic and playful, and really it puts kind of art and culture at the center of reality rather than kind of the periphery where it is in our normal lives. And to me, it's like, when you go to Burning Man the first time, they say, welcome home. And it really did have that feeling for me. It's like, oh, this is home. That other thing, which burners call the default world, that's like some strange aberration that we're like just having to deal with, So for me, the question, and if you think about this, this possibility that we are going through this rapid, accelerated transformation process, which I think we're a lot of people are feeling and dealing with on a lot of levels. We can see it, what's happening politically and ecologically and militarily. This is a very critical juncture, and it's really, people say, oh, it's always a critical juncture, and I would have to say not like this. This is a totally different level of critical juncture.
It may be a more critical level of juncture. In other words, an elbow in the continuum. But I'm also really cautious about too literally overlaying a time template over linear time. I remember I had a bunch of talks with Terrence McKenna, and with his I had a great talk with Dennis McKenna after Terrence. And when I was talking with Dennis, I was like, well, why did you pick 2012? Why did you overlay the fractal in this way? And he said, well, actually, originally we overlaid it on 1973, on Terrence's birthday, and then that came and it didn't happen. So we put it on 2012, we figure we'll both be in our 60s by then, and if it doesn't happen, it won't matter. Plus, it was sort of the bumps and valleys seem to match some, historical kind of bumps and valleys. So he's the guy who was he was the one who was buzzing for 3 weeks or whatever it was while Terrence was writing everything down. So Dennis, the guy who was even in the very focus of the maelstrom, kind of had a lighthearted view about just how lockstep we get with this is the moment where that's going to happen. And I get scared of moments like that, to put too much, well, I get scared about anything future-oriented rather than present-oriented. I always look at, we just do this thing and then this will happen. We do this, that's the way really nasty movements can get started too. So I'm always thinking it's a lot safer to say, right now is when it has to happen. In other words, it's not a matter of having some revolution or some big shift that's going to come. It's a matter of it's happening now. In other words, this is all we've got is the moment that we're in, rather than this sort of delayed gratification of the great flip.